All right, we'll get started then. Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today. We hope you had a wonderful first day of conferencing. The sessions were excellent, and we're really looking forward to the second day of the DE24 conference. So I am Saida Jamila. I am a survey research analyst at the Research Institute at Dallas College. I'm joined by my colleagues and co-presenters today, Mr. Navi Dhaliwal. He's our economic analyst at the Research Institute, and Ms. McKenna Griffin, our data visualization specialist at the Research Institute. I also want to thank Brian Hutchins for facilitating this session and our moderator as well. We'll leave some time for questions at the end of the presentation. But feel free to write in your questions in the chat as well, and one of us will try to respond. And if we don't get to it, we'll try to get to it at the end of the presentation. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about who we are, who Dallas College is, who the Research Institute is. As of course you can tell, we're located in Dallas, Texas. We're one of the largest community college systems in Texas and also in the country. We consolidated in 2019 from a district of 7 distinct institutions into a single college. Now we have 7 campuses. We serve more than 122,000 students. 60% of those students are female, almost half are first generation. And a significant proportion of our students are also Pell eligible. We're also a Hispanic serving institution. Our student body is almost half Hispanic, about 20% are African American, and about 17% or so are white students. Dual enrollment programming is very expansive at Dallas College and just in the DFW Metroplex at large. Approximately 30% of our students are dual credit students. We have 150 dual credit partnerships with many high schools, PTECs, early college high schools in our area school districts. And so this slide is a really quick overview of the Research Institute. So we are housed within Dallas College's Student Success Division. And our focus is primarily on mixed methods, longitudinal studies that analyze student outcomes and experiences throughout a student's educational journey. And we also evaluate how well the college is serving the needs of our students and community. I'm sorry, this slide is pretty busy, but if you just look at the bottom left hand corner, you'll see highlights from our research agenda. We focus on a variety of topics, including return on investment, economic mobility, student MELT, enrollment and retention, student debt, and the relationship between dual credit and academic and earnings outcomes of our area students. We collaborate with both internal and external partners who support our work, specifically our collaboration with the Texas Schools Project at the University of Texas at Dallas, which also kind of allows us to use their Education Research Center data holdings, has enabled us to work on this dual credit research, which is the focus of today's presentation. So we know that, we all know that there is a large and growing demand and interest in dual enrollment, given the expansion of dual credit in the last 10 years. Much of this has been propelled by policy in Texas. It was HB 505 in 2015 that relaxed the requirements of dual credit and lifted limitations on the number of courses that can be taken and when they can be taken in high school. And we also know, from research and the literature that there are immediate benefits, right, of dual credit, particularly for students who have high success in dual credit courses. It fosters a lot of confidence and momentum for high school achievement. And, and we also know, that there are longer term benefits, such as an increased likelihood of college enrollment and completing a degree. However, the relationship between dual credit participation and more, farther away outcomes or distant outcomes, such as longer run earnings over time, have not been studied as much. So we chose to conduct a more historical study with an older cohort of high school graduating students to examine how dual credit influenced their educational and financial trajectories up to a decade after high school graduation. So today's presentation of the key findings from our historical study are really driven by two questions. One is, do the benefits of dual credit extend to longer term wage outcomes? And two, are these benefits equitable across student populations? And beyond this historical study that we'll delve into today, we'll also look at some of the tools that we've created, to understand trends and outcomes of our most recent dual credit students at Dallas College. And we'll discuss how institutional data can be analyzed and visualized internally to track dual credit students over time. And then, of course, finally, we'll conclude with the Q&A discussion. So the population of focus in our longitudinal study is one cohort of high school graduates from 22 public school districts in the Dallas College service region. So these are school districts that are in close proximity to a Dallas College campus. And specifically, we selected the 2011 graduating cohort to allow for up to a 10-year window after high school graduation to measure students' wages. So we were able to capture students' wages through the first quarter of 2021. And we also wanted to kind of minimize COVID-19 effects on earnings as much as possible. So that's why we selected the 2011 cohort. And as I mentioned earlier, we've partnered with UT Dallas faculty at the Texas Schools Project who've kind of guided our work. And the Texas Schools Project also houses the ERC, the Education Research Center, which is the state's longitudinal data warehouse. K through 12 data from the Texas Education Agency, higher education data for public institutions from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, wage data from the Texas Workforce Commission, and as well as NSC data are all stored in the ERC. And so from these data sources, we were able to construct our longitudinal data set for this study. So in the study, we addressed three overarching research questions. First, we determine which students are more likely to participate in dual credit and which students are less likely to participate, and what are their demographic, academic, and environmental characteristics. Second, we investigate if there are correlations between dual credit participation and post-secondary educational, employment, and wage outcomes over an 8 to 10-year period. And finally, we analyze if the correlations or relationships between dual credit participation and the educational earnings outcomes vary across specific student populations. So here we can see the timeline of the outcome variables in the study. We begin with our 2011 graduates and measure if there is a relationship between dual credit participation and both immediate college going and delayed college enrollment. We also measure vertical transfer, and the way we define vertical transfer in our study is those students who only entered a 2-year institution following high school graduation. So by fall 2013, they entered a 2-year institution and then transferred to a 4-year institution within 4 years of the time they entered the 2-year institution. We also measure the relationship between dual credit and credential attainment by any credential attained and by level of credential attained. And we measure the likelihood of the student, the likelihood of students to borrow student loans while they were enrolled in post-secondary, and as well as the total student debt amounts. So all of this by 6 years after high school graduation. And then finally, we analyzed the students' quarterly earnings up to 10 years following high school graduation, and if they meet living wage thresholds as defined by the MIT living wage calculator. So our full sample is comprised of 20,000 or over 20,850 students who graduated in spring 2011. The treatment group or the group that has of students who took at least one dual credit class in 11th or 12th grade is 3,783 students. So the way that we've defined dual credit participation is at least taking or enrolling in one course in high school and not necessarily completing one course. And then there are 17,075 comparison students in our sample. So those who did not take a dual credit course in high school. In general, we wanted to ensure the students were enrolled in the appropriate grade level from 11th through 12th grade, just to kind of account for their educational and demographic background and academic performance, both in middle school and through high school. And we also conducted subgroup analysis with specific populations, such as for free and reduced lunch participants and non-participants, or for those who had a limited English proficient status and those who did not, and within race and ethnicity and gender and test performance categories as well. We used a broad set of control variables in our regression analyses, including indicators for special programs, academic assessments, socioeconomic status, demographics, and school environment. And to do our analysis, we employed a logistic and pooled OLS regression methods. We used a propensity score modeling approach using inverse propensity weighting to compare outcomes between dual credit participants and non-participants. So before we delve into the outcomes, we'll quickly revisit the first kind of research question we highlighted, which was, which student characteristics are associated with dual credit participation in our sample. And overall, we find that student groups that traditionally perform higher academically also have higher odds of participating in dual credit. Students who attend early college high schools and schools with high graduation rates are also more likely to take dual credit. But students who are more academically and socioeconomically vulnerable have lower odds of taking dual credit. Interestingly, we also find that students from the highest performing high schools and those from the lowest performing high schools are less likely to take dual credit than students from, average performing schools. So I've talked quite a bit. So now we'll turn to my colleague, Mr. Dhaliwal, who will take a deeper dive into the findings.
Thank you, Dr. Jamila, and good morning, everyone. My name is Navi Dhaliwal. I'm an economic analyst at the Research Institute at Dallas College, and I'll walk us through the findings of our study. I want to start with two kind of stylized facts or two overarching findings to sort of ground some of the results that we'll go into in more detail. The first is that, largely consistent with prior research, we found positive correlations between dual credit participation and educational outcomes, including college enrollment, attainment, as well as transfer across nearly all student populations. But the second pertains to earnings outcomes, and that is that while we did find overall a positive relationship in our full sample between dual credit participation and earnings, particularly from around 6 years after high school graduation onward, that result was not uniform across student populations. And so that's something that we'll explore in our next few slides. This next slide shows a snapshot of our results in detail. And I know there's a lot of information here, so try to walk through this slowly. We wanted to just provide a high-level overview of the results, and thinking back to the timeline of outcomes that we presented earlier. In this table, the columns are those different outcomes, such as immediate enrollment, delayed enrollment, transfer, and then various measures of attainment, as well as enrollment with debt. And the rows are for our full sample, the first row, and 13 subsamples, 13 specific student populations that we also analyzed. While we aren't showing the coefficients of our analyses in this table, we wanted to start here just to show kind of the overwhelming presence of positive, statistically significant relationships between dual credit participation and many of these measures of post-secondary success. However, when we introduce some of the earnings outcomes that we consider, which are more distal, we see that there are more mixed results. And so in this table, the positive green arrows indicate a statistically significant positive relationship, and the red arrows that are horizontal indicate no significant relationship. So on the one hand, it's somewhat affirming to see that there's never an adverse effect of dual credit we observe per se. But when we look to earnings, and here we looked at it in 3 different ways, we start to see that maybe the benefits don't extend to all the subsamples that we looked at. To briefly talk about the different ways that we looked at earnings outcomes over time, we presented 3 different columns here that consider earnings. The first is that we took students' log quarterly wages over time in order to calculate a percent change in wages from participating in dual credit. The second are that we use dichotomous measures of wages above a couple different thresholds. So as Dr. Jamila mentioned, for living wage attainment, we turned to the MIT Living Wage Calculator and used a recent 2022 indicator of living wages, applied it historically, which was around $35,000 per year. And as our dependent variable, assessed whether students were above or below that threshold. For economic mobility, likewise, we used a dichotomous approach. So we used a threshold there of $49,000 per year, and that's state Texas earnings at the 60th percentile from the Post-Secondary Value Commission. So moving on to our next slide, we're going to go into the earnings results in the most detail here. I think in part because our results with respect to post-secondary attainment and enrollment were largely consistent with prior research. We'll start with results for the full sample that I'll walk through here on this slide in detail, and then we'll see a similar slide for the different subsamples that we looked at. So starting with the earnings of students who participated in dual credit compared to those who did not participate in dual credit, earnings were about 3% higher per quarter on average for dual credit participants during the 10-year window after high school graduation. And so if I can turn your attention to the figure on the left here, this chart shows median quarterly earnings over time. These are summary statistics from our analysis, but the inverse propensity weights have been applied. So we're trying to create a fair comparison between dual credit participants and the non-participants who are most similar and have the most similar characteristics to those participants, so that the difference is mitigated against bias for selection into dual credit. So you can see really around 2016 to 2017 is when we began to see separation between the wages or earnings of dual credit students and students who did not participate in dual credit from our cohort who graduated in 2011. And on the right side, we also looked at the living wage outcome variable. And there too, we saw a significant increase in students' odds of attaining a living wage. And here we show the share of students who attained a living wage who had not participated in dual credit was 61.5%, whereas those who participated in dual credit, it was 66.5%. I'll mention that on all of the slides as we proceed, the dual credit population, our participants will be shown in that dashed line or crossed shading, and we'll show non-dual credit in solid lines. And I'll also mention here that these weren't the only ways that we considered students' economic outcomes. So while not shown on the slide, we also considered things like students' cumulative earnings over that whole 10-year span. And in that case, we saw a sizable increase from dual credit participation to the tune of about 9.4%. And we also looked at things like the number of quarters that students were employed over that 10-year span. And again, for dual credit participants, that was higher by about 3 quarters. So let's move on to some of our specific groups, starting with gender. When we looked at gender, both male and female students had similar increase in wages from dual credit participation. In the chart on the left, you can see male is in orange here, and female is represented in blue. And both groups, the dashed lines are higher than the solid lines, particularly again, after about that 6-year mark. Although we do see earnings being higher for male students in our study, both groups experience a similar magnitude of increase. And the same can be seen when we look at living wage attainment. But here, the percentage point increase is even higher for female students compared to male students. Moving on to race and ethnicity. And I apologize that there's so many lines on this figure. But when it came to race and ethnicity and looking at quarterly average wages, we actually found that only white students experienced a statistically significant increase from dual credit participation. So I'll call your attention to the orange lines in this messy line graph that reflect white students. You can almost tell at a glance that there's a pretty big gap between the earnings of the dual credit participants and the non-participants in the white student subpopulation compared to the others. When we looked at living wage attainment as our outcome variable, we saw a statistically significant increase for both African American students and white students, but not for Asian students or Hispanic students. I'll next look at limited English proficiency. And so when it came to limited English proficiency, again, it was non-limited English proficiency students that saw a significant increase in their quarterly wages of about 3%. And students with limited English proficiency did not see a significant increase. The same was true when we looked at living wage attainment. The effect for limited English proficiency students was not significant. I will note that this was our smallest subpopulation, so we didn't have a lot of power for this analysis in particular. Next up, we considered free and reduced lunch or other forms of economic disadvantage. This was an interesting result in that free and reduced lunch students actually saw a significant increase in earnings from dual credit participation to the tune of about 4%. And we didn't observe the same for non-free and reduced lunch students in the quarterly earnings data set. And you can kind of notice in the orange line, some of this may be due to the first years after high school graduation, in which the students who were not receiving free and reduced lunch, who were in dual credit, seemed to have lower earnings than the ones who did not take dual credit, even though after about 2016, again, that flips. When we looked at living wage attainment, though, both groups had greater odds of attaining living wages. And our last subsample that we analyzed is test performance. When it came to test performance, we focused on 3 different levels measured based on 8th grade math and reading scores. We have in green students who had a commended score on 1 or more of their 8th grade assessments. In blue, we have students who had a passing score on both assessments, and in orange, students who had a failing score on 1 or more assessments. And you can see a pretty clear stratification in students' earnings based on their test performance, with the green being the highest, which is commended, the highest performance, and the orange, which was tax failing, being the lowest. When we looked at just earnings, it was only commended students who saw a significant increase. And when we looked at living wage attainment, both commended and passing students saw a significant increase. I'll also note here that even as we sort of observe continuously in all of these subsamples, a likely mediation effect. We didn't conduct a mediation analysis here, but just based on the timing as we observe these line charts, it seems likely, or there's evidence to suggest that there's, probably a mediation channel through which dual credit participation is increasing college enrollment and credential attainment, and then that is having a contribution to earnings later on. So just to recap some of our findings, I'll bring back the slide here. Overall, we largely find positive findings when it comes to educational attainment, transfer, and enrollment. The findings are more mixed when we think about earnings, but they are positive for our overall sample. And I'll also share that we do have the coefficients for all of these, and we're currently working on writing these up into a paper, but we'd be happy to discuss any of the results in more detail for our more technically inclined audience members. And with that, I will turn things over to my colleague, Ms. McKenna Griffin, who's going to talk to us about some of the more recent endeavors we've taken to analyze our more recent cohorts of dual credit students at Dallas College.
Thank you, Navi. And hi, everyone. My name is McKenna Griffin, and I'm the Data Visualization Specialist with the Research Institute. The project that you just heard about was a longitudinal study that examined a cohort of students who graduated from high school in 2011. And we all know that the field of dual credit has really grown in the past 10 years. Specifically, it's been getting larger and growing in demand. In the state of Texas, that looked like House Bill 505, which was implemented in 2015. What that bill did is it decreased the minimum age that students can start taking dual credit courses, and it removed the cap, so students were allowed to take more classes while dual enrolled. What we've done at Dallas College is create an interactive dashboard that allows us to continue to monitor dual credit enrollment. We can see enrollment trends, we can look at how equitable our programs are, and then we can also look at some short and longer term outcomes at Dallas College to see how our current students are performing. So what I'm going to do is show you several screenshots from that dashboard, and then at the end I'll share a link so you can take a look at that on your own. So in this first slide, we're going to be looking at dual credit enrollment. I'm sorry, can we get the next slide? Thank you. And here we're going to be seeing, and actually in all subsequent figures as well, we're going to be seeing dual credit students represented in red and non-dual credit students represented in blue. We've also restricted the entire sample to look at only students who are age 13 to 20, so that our non-dual credit students can be a little bit more comparable with our dual credit students, but we want to kind of take that with a grain of salt. So we see here that our dual credit enrollment has increased year over year, especially following the implementation of House Bill 505 in 2015. Those numbers start to plateau in 2020, so you'll see really similar enrollment from 2020 onwards. But that's also great news because this is during the COVID pandemic. And we know that dual enrollment, we can see that dual enrollment is really resilient to the effects of the pandemic, whereas our non-dual credit enrollment declined during that time period. We can also look at our enrollment by demographic group, and not shown here, but included in the dashboard, we see very similar proportions of dual credit and non-dual credit students by gender and by race and ethnicity. The biggest difference is in first generation student status. So we have fewer dual credit students who are first generation. And this could be for a couple of reasons. The first is it might just be a data quality or data collection issue because dual credit students do not have to fill out a federal financial aid form or a state financial aid form. So those are the FAFSA or the TASPA. And so we are relying solely on internal surveys. Ours is called the Student Information Profile Survey. To collect first generation student status from our dual credit students. And that might be either incomplete or incorrect because it just doesn't have that kind of weight that our financial aid surveys carry, our financial aid forms carry. And so the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're really collecting valid data and accurate data from our dual credit students. And that's one thing that we're starting to work on now. The second thing that could be explaining this difference in first generation student status is, and I'm sorry, can we go back one slide? Thanks. Is we can be, our dual credit students who are currently enrolled might be from families who are more familiar with the higher education environment or might have more experience with post-secondary education. So one thing that we want to make sure that we're doing is marketing to potential dual credit families the benefits of participating in dual credit and sharing that this program is available to them and encouraging more families who are less experienced with post-secondary education to participate in dual credit. And that's because our students are doing very well. So in the next slide, we see students are performing very well at the course level. On the y-axis here, we have the percentage of students who are passing courses by either course modality or course length. And we see that overall, our dual credit students are passing between 80 and 90% of their classes. And that is even higher for our face-to-face courses and our 16-week or longer term courses. Now, this is where I want you to kind of take a grain of salt with the comparison between dual credit and non-dual credit students, because we know that dual credit students on average are taking more general and introductory classes, while a higher proportion of our non-dual credit students are taking more advanced courses. There's also a lot of differences in students' home lives and level of responsibility. So what we want to focus on here is really celebrating that our dual credit students are doing very well. And not focusing as much on that comparison. These course level outcomes translate into semester level outcomes in the next slide. And we can see that dual credit students on average are attempting 6 credits or about 2 classes per semester. And they're completing on average 87% of the credits they attempt, which results in a nice round semester GPA of 3.0. Now that's a semester GPA, not a cumulative GPA. In comparison, our non-dual credit students are attempting more classes, which is understandable. So 10.2 is about 3 to 4 courses per semester, and they're completing almost 70% of the credits they attempt for a semester GPA of 2.7. Now we've seen that dual credit enrollment has been increasing. Students are starting earlier and participating for longer. They're also completing a high proportion of the courses that they attempt, which results in students who are able to complete credentials while concurrently dual enrolled. So in our next slide, we're going to see students organized by their first year as a dual credit student. And we see an increasing number of students year over year who are able to complete a credential, either an associate degree or a certificate, while they're still in high school. And this is really exciting. In the far right column, we see students who started in 2019, 2020. About 12% of that cohort was able to complete a credential while still dual enrolled. And this isn't even accounting for any subsequent enrollment or credential completion, right? So we're not even looking at bachelor's degrees, transfers, etc. This is all while still in high school. Our next and final positive outcome for this project is looking at our boomerang students. So boomerang students are dual credit students who enroll at Dallas College as dual credit students. They graduate from high school, and then they come back and re-enroll as traditional students. And we can see here that in our first text box, we can see that 20% of our dual credit students are actually returning to Dallas College within 1 year of their final dual credit term. That number almost doubles to 38% of our students returning within 2 years and increases again to 46% within 3 years. This actually surpasses the 50% mark within 5 years. So within 5 years of their high school graduation or their final dual credit term, half of our dual credit students are coming back and re-enrolling at Dallas College in some way, shape, or form. So that might mean that they're taking a summer class. That might mean that they're coming back to finish up their associate degree if they hadn't completed it while enrolled. They might be coming back to reskill or upskill or get another certificate. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why students are coming back, but it's great news for a couple of reasons. The first is that this means kind of indirectly that Dallas College is creating a comfortable environment for our students. So these students have chosen to come back, to re-enroll, to re-participate, to take courses with our faculty, and they are choosing to come back and pay tuition for that experience. So that means that they're, to us, that they're pretty happy with the experience that they had. It's also great financially for the institution. So dual credit participation, dual credit enrollment does not contribute financially via tuition to Dallas College. But when students choose to come back and re-enroll, they're now paying tuition and contributing. So it's kind of helping dual credit students on the front end and also contributing to the college on the back end. So with that, I promised you a link to our dashboard. So on the next slide, we're going to see our interactive report, which is called A Holistic Look at Dallas College's Dual Credit Students. This is available on our website, and I highly encourage you to access. There's a link here if you get access to the slides. There's also a QR code, or you can find it on our website. Please go into the report, play with the filters. You can't break it, so check it out. And if you have any questions or any concerns, or if you notice a typo, you can reach out to the Research Institute or to me directly, and my email information is on that page. In closing today, we've talked about a few things. The first is our key findings from our historical study, which showed that dual credit participation is positively correlated with both education outcomes and earnings outcomes, but that relationship is not seen for all student populations. We also see that there's a growing demand for dual credit, and that has been supported by policy. So we hope that some of these positive outcomes that we're seeing in past cohorts are going to continue to expand to more student groups because the program has been expanding in current times. But we do still see some current disparities that we're hoping to address as a college and even on a larger scale. So with that, I hope that you all will put some questions in the chat. It looks like we have plenty of time. I also want to highlight our last slide, which has a link to our website. We're also available on LinkedIn. Here's our email address at the bottom and a QR code to the website. I believe we also have a listserv on our website that I definitely encourage you to sign up for if you are able. And I would like to invite Mr. Dhaliwal and Dr. Jamila back, and we will be able to answer any of your questions in our remaining time. So thank you very much.
Hi, all. Let me jump in. Are you able to see the Q&A? It looks like some questions came in the Q&A section.
I do not see it. I have the Q&A up, but I don't see any questions.
Oh, okay. Let me start pasting a few to the chat.
That would be great.
Yeah. I'll just paste them in and let you all decide, but I don't want to stop anyone from asking out loud if they would like to, coming off mute.
Okay, so I see I'm already off mute. I was typing my question here. My apologies, everyone. My name is Christopher Bailey. I'm from St. Louis Community College. My question is, how were you able to maintain contact with dual credit students once they graduate from high school? Like, how did you maintain continuity, like of tracking those students? I take it maybe National Clearinghouse data, possibly. I just wanted to know a little bit more about that.
I'll take that question. So what we used, most states have an SLDS system, like a state longitudinal data system or warehouse. And Texas, it's kind of the same concept, but the data is stored a little differently. So we have 3 different education research centers across the state, one at UT Dallas, one at the University of Houston, and one at UT Austin. And so those research centers house all of our state level state level and student level data. So K through 12 data that comes from the Texas Education Agency, post-secondary, higher education enrollment, attainment, data that comes from the Higher Education Coordinating Board from the state, and as well as the NSC data that you referenced, as well as workforce data. So wages are all kind of stored in the education research centers. And so in order to access that data, researchers submit a proposal, and we're able to, once that's approved, we're able to kind of use our data warehouse to create, or simulate like a longitudinal data system that we would have to go in and use separate files to create. So that's how that's the data that we're accessing. These are not like student reported data that we are collecting, via surveying or anything like that, but that's what our data source is. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
And I see some questions that have been pasted in the meeting chat now that I'd be happy to answer. So I'm just starting from the top. There's a question about wondering what we might expect to see in the next 10-year cycle, maybe 2016 to 2026. And I think that's a fascinating question, particularly given the expansion of dual enrollment and the sort of more innovative or newer modalities of delivery and things like the implementation of PTEX and greater adoption of that type of programming. I think we might see quite different results, and I'd be especially curious about those immediate years after high school graduation, in which we don't see as much of an earnings difference between dual credit participants and non-participants. Unfortunately, our data set, the earnings that we had available to us ended in 2021. So that was as far as we were able to track student earnings, and part of why we ended up choosing a more historical cohort. Another question I see is, can you speak more about the higher wage findings? We indicated that white students saw higher wages, while both white and African-American students saw some increase with dual enrollment. I think that's a really important nuance to kind of elaborate on. So when we analyzed our earnings outcomes and economics outcomes, we tried modeling our idea of a positive economic outcome in a couple of different ways. When we modeled it just by taking the log of quarterly earnings and tracking students' earnings quarter by quarter, we didn't see a significant increase from dual credit participation for African-American students. But when we instead looked at a 0-1 sort of question about whether or not students attain living wages, we did see an increase. And so I think there's some richness there that we'd like to probably probe further. But that may, one way to think about that might be that we see some effect of dual credit kind of on the boundary of having a living wage or not having a living wage, but not necessarily an effect across the entire earnings distribution for students. So there does seem to be some positive effect as far as attaining a living wage. But when we look at the value of earnings as a whole, we don't necessarily see an increase. Another question asks whether we looked at types of courses, careers, and paths and impact. And again, a lot of great questions in the chat. So thank you all for the participation. This is something that we really would like to look at. But one limitation in the data set that we had is that we don't really have occupation information of the students that we analyze in that study. So at least for our historical study, we are able to see the industries and sectors that students go on to work in, but not necessarily the jobs they hold. In our Dallas College data, this is something that I think we're striving to be able to look at more closely. Maybe McKenna, if you could speak to that a little more.
Sure. So one other kind of limitation about courses and career paths for our older cohort is that students were only able to start taking dual credit in 11th grade. And so there were much fewer kind of pathways for dual credit students while in dual credit. In terms of long-term outcomes, that is something we're starting to look at, and I'm going to pop a couple of our other dashboards in the chat about dual credit or about field of study. These do not have a pivot by dual credit, so that's something that we're hoping to expand on as we're looking at more and more recent data. We're definitely really interested in looking at kind of the P-TECH pathways and outcomes for those students as well. So the first dashboard I'll pop in is our academic pathways, which uses the same data set or a very similar data set that is used in the study here. So these are our Dallas area students, and I'll just pop that in the chat right now. And there's a tab on there called Outcomes by Field of Study, which looks at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board groups SIP codes into 16 fields of study. And we can look at some of our wage outcomes by degree completion, for degree completers by the degree, the SIP code of their degree. We also have another one, which might take me just a second to pull up, so I'll pop that into the chat in a little bit, that looks at Dallas College students and their occupation codes, which is from a partnership that we had at Dallas College with MC Bringing Glass that tracked students in kind of a different way. So that's kind of a big pivot from the project that we're talking about today, but it's a start to look at some of these occupation outcomes. And like I said, we're trying to expand on that in the future. I hope that answered your question. Is there any follow-up to that? I kind of rambled.
And I probably did too, as I went on question by question. So happy to follow up on any of the other questions as well. And there was one that I didn't get to earlier, which was, did you happen to look at intersections and outcomes? For example, race and socioeconomic status, or race, gender, and socioeconomic status? I think that's another great question. And I would say, unfortunately, the answer is no for our historical study. We explored the possibility of doing so, but we're really limited by our sample size when it came to looking at intersections of specific groups. So I think if we were to broaden our analysis, maybe outside the Dallas area to a state level, or pool together multiple cohorts across years, that might be a possibility. But in our more recent tools, we do try to include at least filters and options in our dashboards to be able to examine kind of the coincidence of different identities, or the intersectionality of different identities, and the potential bearing that has on student outcomes. So I think it's something that is top of mind that we weren't able to address in the historical study, but I would like to be able to better address in the future.